All right. I really do encourage you to ask questions and yeah, like it would be great if this could be interactive. So my background is in computer vision and machine learning. And what I've kind of done for my career is trying to figure out what's working now or soon to be working in the machine learning research field and figure out how it can be usefully applied to biology problems and how to make it usable by biologists. And in particular, we've been focusing mainly on animal behavior analysis. So for a very long time, kind of the thing that was working in...
Turn off, or maybe you can do that.
This thing?
Hide the display.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so for a very long time, the thing that's been working in machine learning is supervised machine learning, right? So this was kind of working to some extent. You know, so I started my PhD in 2000. Actually, I've been working in machine learning for quite a long time. But deep learning, kind of the deep learning revolution started in 2012 with kind of AlexNet, and so like these kinds of approaches really started to work, you know, in the early 2010s, and. So this was great. You know, this allowed us to do things that were very time consuming for humans, like being able to track the animals or to train classifiers that could categorize their behavior. But it quickly kind of became apparent to me that this was kind of the easy part of the problem, right? Like, you know, we kind of knew what the solution looked like. We could measure whether we had achieved that solution. And we had this bigger problem that was kind of beyond the abilities of humans, which is what do you do with all of these trajectories after you've collected them and you've done kind of everything you can think of with supervised machine learning to analyze your data. And so, you know, this is a kind of data compression, right? Like videos are really big in terms of number of bits. Trajectories are much smaller, but they're still actually, like, if you take kind of this like large trajectory data set that you collect after kind of doing all of this, it's still actually quite large and very opaque. So this is, I'm showing kind of key point tracking for one fly for 3 seconds, and I'm just showing the kind of change in the XY coordinates of these key points. And we did one experiment where we went through kind of 2,000 different GAL4 lines, so 2,000 different genotypes of flies, and we had 20 flies times 8 trials for each of those different genotypes, right? So we kind of have just a ridiculous amount of data that we actually don't really know what to do with. And so, you know, the first thing that we kind of went to, and I think this is kind of always the first thing one should try, is kind of use your intuition, kind of do kind of data science types of things, compute statistics that you think are meaningful. So we computed things like what was the average speed of the flies, or what fraction of the time did the flies spend chasing, or how fast did the flies walk while they were chasing for each of these different 2,000 different GAL4 lines. We were able to make some kind of sense of this data. But it always, to me, felt like we were really kind of compressing the problem too much, right? So we have this kind of really big, rich data set of behavior, and we're always kind of taking it down to a 2D plot because that's what we as humans can visualize on our computer screen. And there's just a lot more richness to behavior than a 2D plot. And so we've been interested in kind of how do we get more out of this kind of data. And so, you know, luckily there was this, you know, second deep learning revolution, which is the generative AI revolution that we've been trying to figure out whether and how it can be applied to the types of problems that we're interested in. And so we've been working actually, like we started doing this before kind of transformers came out. So we started doing this actually with recurrent neural networks. But the idea was to take the behavior of a fly and try to just train a deep network that predicts what the fly will do in the next time point. And if anyone has worked with transformers, do people know how transformers work?
Teach us.
Okay. Yes. I mean, I think I'm not going to go into the details of like the neural net, but the goal, right, is you take a sequence of words, you have a really, really big network, and you're just trying to predict what the next word is. And so you can see that there's kind of a similarity between this problem here and the trajectory prediction problem. And actually, when we were doing this kind of recurrent neural net research, it was also inspired by the NLP, the natural language processing research, which initially kind of before transformers came out was focused on recurrent neural nets. And then once transformers came out in 2017, quickly changed to just transformers all the time. And so we're interested in, whether we can adapt some of the successes of transformers, which are the technology behind large language models, things like ChatGPT, to these types of problems. And just to mention, there have been I don't know, machine learning is just exploding right now. It's really exciting and also scary. Very hard to keep up with. So there are other kind of new things that are newer than this that we are kind of working on. So we're spending a lot of time on agentic AI for science. We're spending some amount of time on reinforcement learning. So there are other things that I'm happy to talk about offline if you're interested in that. But yeah, so today I'll talk about this kind of an approach. Okay, so the big difference between these language models and what we want to do is we want to apply it to trajectory data. And so what I mean by that is we've tracked all of these flies. So there are 10 flies. Half of them are male, half of them are female, walking around in this dish. We've tracked 19 key points on each of the flies, or actually 21 key points on each of the flies. And we want to kind of model that data with a transformer. And then hopefully learn something.
So you want to model the individual movements, not just the trajectory.
Yeah, exactly. And so we're just trying to fit everything. We don't know. I mean, it's a kind of open question whether it is a good idea to model the limb movements as well as kind of the global movements of the fly. But right now we're just throwing everything at it. And this kind of parallels what people are doing with language models too. They just kind of go to the finest scale of resolution that seems reasonable, which are these tokens, which are kind of pieces of words, and they model everything at that finest resolution, just with one very straightforward model to some extent, and just kind of brute force it with a giant model. Okay, so one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about, and it's so kind of everyone in machine learning saw the success of transformers.
Sorry,
Go ahead. Yeah.
So I don't think that's the smallest token for a word, right? It's a letter.
Yeah.
And would it have failed if they used letters instead of those?
It's a good question.
So my question is, would it fail if you're using these particular key points versus whole legs or even multiple?
Yeah. I suspect it would be fine to use letters, but people aren't doing it. I was discussing this with Claude yesterday to kind of figure out if people have been, sorry, all of my scientists, Claude is my best scientific collaborator at this point. But I think there's some amount of, why don't people do shorter tokens and why don't people do longer tokens? I've read a lot of papers about people trying to do longer tokens and it being pretty not very, it doesn't look like it works very well. But a lot of machine learning is where the crowd is. And there's just a lot more engineering effort where all the people are. And they've just kind of figured everything out for this thing. So I suspect it's more of that than it is byte pair encoding is the best thing. But there hasn't been as far as I could tell, and as far as Claude knew, there was not a kind of conclusive study on this type of thing.
Tokens, 210 long vectors that was
Yeah, that's a great intuition. What should our token be? And right now, our token is a single frame and some kind of representation of the trajectory at that frame. But I think that's an open question. I'll go through. I have a couple slides on exactly that question.
Sorry, soft tokens at all instead of this discretization?
I haven't. I don't know soft tokens.
We've been trying it with the biomic GPT a little bit.
Okay.
It sometimes helps.
Okay.
For reconstruction, it helps. I don't know if it helps for forecasting.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I don't know what is a soft token?
Instead of discretizing, you just feed in a continuous representation and bypass the tokenization step of the language.
So there are so everyone in machine learning who has data that is not language wants to apply transformers to it, and they're all trying to look for ways to take their modality of data and get it into tokens, right? And so the most popular thing to do as of 6 months ago, I haven't it's moving so fast, right? Is this vector quantization VAE type of thing, which we've tried it. it's kind of painful. And I hear that at like places like Google, they have a VQVAE team that just like tokenizes stuff for you, because there's actually a lot of like tweaking of stuff that has to go into it. It doesn't train well. It's like kind of a big mess. Yeah, it would be, I will, we can talk about it later. It'd be great to try. Oh.
Well, not to get stuck on this token thing, but I think I confused with something. So like when you do have language just naturally comes in tokens,
Yeah.
but the first thing that they do with the tokens is put them into an embedding space.
Yeah.
At which point they become vectors.
Yeah.
So if your data just consists of vectors in the first place, why can't you just bypass this whole thing and just, all right, you have vectors, go from there?
That's what we kind of do. So for the inputs, we don't tokenize. We work in the, so there's the input and the output, and these are kind of different things. For the input, they directly put it into this linear embedding. And so, yeah, we don't tokenize for our input, but we do tokenize for the output. And that's because we want to, like, their output is this one-hot encoding, which is, a probability distribution. And so there you do, if you want to represent kind of this multimodal distribution, you do need to have, at least in this way, there are other ways to do it, you do need to have a one-hot encoding. Other things we have tried, and I know Anne has tried, are diffusion models, and currently diffusion models are terrible for us. Either we did something wrong or they're actually terrible for us. We don't, it's very hard to differentiate those things, but that is kind of, and I've tried like mixture model types of things, and it suffers from mode collapse basically. So I do think like kind of the engineering that's gone into kind of the transformers and all of this is kind of geared toward this one hot encoding output. But yeah, so it's all great for the input. It's a problem for the output.
Well, maybe this just more exposes my own naivete, and maybe this question actually maybe better addresses it, but it seems like the sort of tokenization sort of presumes a kind of symbol first, whereas this is a signal problem, not a symbol problem.
Yeah.
Right? And then you're trying to turn it into a symbol problem. And I just wonder if like there's a smarter front end that involves, dynamical systems with attracting invariant manifolds that you're sort of pre-structuring and sort of tokenizing on sort of attractor dynamics first or something. Like something at the front end seems like it's going to make the whole rest of the chain be sort of suboptimal if you're sort of not sort of respecting the dynamics of an organism, which is a dynamical system with kinematics and inertia and all those sorts of things.
Yeah. So we are thinking about all of those things. I mean, so this is kind of related to having a continuous distribution type of output. It is important, right? So what these transformers are doing is modeling the distribution. They're not just kind of predicting a single, what the next word actually is. You would be pretty disappointed if all your transformer did is memorize all the text on the internet, right? I mean, it kind of does that a little bit, but it also seems to model the distribution of language, right? And so we do definitely need to have a probabilistic output. And what the form of that probabilistic output is kind of an open question, right? And it could be something much more geared to kind of what behavior is like. And I think like multi-timescale things, whether it's like a continuous representation. The thing with continuous representation is just like, there's like the reality of machine learning that is, like you're training it with, or you're optimizing with gradient descent, and like your criterion, kind of the loss function has some maybe weirdness to it that kind of results in mode collapse, right? Where it's just like, I'm going to put everything, like if you kind of just have a mixture model or something, it's going to be like, I'm just going to put everything in this bucket because, and I guess this is kind of one of the things that I think is very important about behavior and kind of anything we care about in the real world is that it follows this kind of long-tailed distribution, that most of the data is well explained by a constant velocity model, right? And then there's like a 1% that is super important that follows very different things. But if you kind of give a lot of these different types of models, it just seems to be like, okay, I'm just going to focus on that 99%. So like, how do you get it to pay attention to that 1%? And I think that's actually a lot of what machine learning research is focused on. But yeah, like, I think you are all, like, we have spent years actually thinking about what should the output be? And if we try this thing or we try that thing, and I've tried like, kind of, I don't know, at least 15 things, I would say. And like, it's made our code kind of a big spaghetti of things that I've tried, and I'll show you some stuff about that as we go on. But these are the best questions. Yeah.
Kristin, also you should feel free to manage your time whichever way, because we're just using this as an excuse to learn everything.
Well, I think like
You're probably learning Wikipedia, but what to do. So
no, I think it's like really good to like, because like I know some people have seen kind of versions of this talk before, and like
yeah, I think the other answer to your thing is like it's just that people throw this at any time series and it works. Like weather forecasting now, I think as far as I understand, it's mostly transformer based. Or so in other words, many things are. So the answer could just be as empirically.
Yeah, I think it is empirically, right? Yeah, but I think it is like, but I do think there are differences, and people are working on those differences. Yeah. But yes, so kind of this is kind of what we've all been saying, right? There are kind of differences about language from behavior, right? Where kind of there is a discretization of words, right? We have spaces, and we have sentences and things like that. So, there is kind of some kind of interesting discretization that already exists, whereas that doesn't really exist for animal behavior yet. I mean, I think some of the work that Anne talked about a couple of days ago and that Bob talked about yesterday, these are kind of relevant to this. But I think one of the things that's quite different about what we are trying to do, and is in the future of AI research, is that like your LLM, like you kind of can't stop it in the middle of talking, right? Like it'll just kind of output a bunch of stuff, right? And it's not a reactive system. But eventually you do want AI that's like a thing you can have a conversation with, and you can kind of be like, wait, stop. Or it could react to sensory information in the environment. And so that's kind of something about kind of the time scale, because animals are behaving at multiple time scales. They might have kind of a long-term plan or kind of behavior sequences that they're implementing, but they also are able to react kind of in the millisecond time range to stimuli. So we do kind of have to have at least some component of our model acting at or kind of modeling at the kind of millisecond level. But we would like to have something that's going at much longer timescales. And an open question to me is whether it's important to kind of explicitly model at this multi-time scale level, or if you can just kind of throw transformers and lots of data at this, and it will implicitly kind of learn this long-term structure just from kind of modeling things at this very short term, which seems to be what's been going on with language. Okay, one of the things that I like about doing this instead of kind of large language model research is that we can do this on our own computers. And so, like modeling the entire, kind of, I don't know, everything about humanity that is on the internet is kind of the goal of LLMs, right? But kind of simple animals in constrained environments are much simpler than all of this kind of digital data. And so, we don't need as big of computers to be able to do this. And the other thing is that tracking works in the lab. And trajectories are much lower dimensional than video. So we can actually kind of train these models that work on trajectories rather than directly on video on relatively reasonable GPUs. And just to kind of as a sanity check that most of the useful information is actually encapsulated in the trajectories. And this was also like while we were kind of seeing if we actually knew how to train diffusion models or not. We trained a keypoint to diffusion model. So it takes kind of the trajectories and it outputs an image of the fly. And that's what's running here. So it's kind of doing this on all of the key points of the flies. The left are real flies, and then the right is the regenerated video based on the key point tracking. So it does kind of, to our eye, look like we've kind of captured most of the information that is actually in the video in these kind of lower dimensional trajectories, and it hopefully is reasonable to operate on trajectories rather than on video.
How do these models, or if these organisms or flies like really spend a lot of time aggregating, or there's a lot of overlap? Like
there is a fair, so this is kind of a constrained environment where the flies can't really walk on top of each other. It's kind of it's like a 3 millimeter plate, but it should be able to train that. We didn't try hard to do that. It's kind of like the diffusion model is working right now on a per fly basis. But these are actually very social flies. We're activating their courtship neurons, and it does kind of look reasonable even when there are kind of two flies together. But I think it's a thing we should try at some point, and we just haven't done it yet. Yeah, it'd be great. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so it's like the background image, and then we overlay little patches of the flies kind of reconstructed from their key points. Yeah. Yeah. So you can that's one of the things. That's why we did this again just because we were seeing if we knew how to train diffusion models. But one of the uses of this, we think, is if you do key point tracking, you can generate multiple images based on those key points to see how much variability is there given those key points. And one of the things that we run into with a lot of our collaborators is some of them will be oh, we tracked 4 key points, and other ones will be oh, we tracked 35 key points, and I think 4 is too few and 35 is probably too many. And so kind of getting a sense of kind of what is each additional key point getting you. Okay, so I think this slide is somewhat adapted from things that Anne actually showed, but in my interpretation of this. So one of the things that, so this is kind of what I would like to understand about animal behavior. And this is kind of coming from, my training is as a computer scientist. I struggle to actually get super interested in neurons. I'm actually really just interested in behavior at the algorithmic level. And so what I want... yeah, but good. At Janelia, it's very hard to find people who don't care about neurons. So at a high level, what algorithm is the animal following? So what does it represent and attend to about its environment? So it's getting all of the sensory input. It's doing some kind of feature extraction. How does it integrate this information over time to make an internal representation of the outside world? And so this is kind of both kind of, maybe things like where are you in the world, or what does the landscape look like, as well as things like emotion and internal state. And then how do these in turn lead to the formation of goals and plans at different timescales? And eventually kind of all of that information is put together to come up with a behavior that you're going to implement at this given time point. How is that behavior output represented? And then that behavior itself is going to go to an explicit motor output. So that's kind of that's kind of my view of animal behavior. And I tried to put lots of loops there because I know it's not that feed forward. But yeah, this is kind of the types of questions that I am hoping that this kind of model can answer. And so to do this, we've been building this kind of transformer-based, agent-based model. And so a lot of people who are kind of doing this type of work, they're just kind of taking the trajectories and then putting it into transformers. And what we're doing instead is kind of trying to say, okay, what is the behavior, having a model represent a single fly that can observe the world. And so this is kind of a cartoon. We have kind of the world state of these flies in a global coordinate system. And each of these flies has its own sensory environment. So we can kind of do some kind of transformation to get the rest of the world in the coordinate system, the egocentric coordinate system of each agent. And then we've handcrafted some approximations of the sensory information that each of these agents will be getting. And I think it's not I think one of the things that with modeling, right, you have to think about the level of detail that you actually want to model things at. And this is kind of an information type of model. This is kind of we think this is the kind of information that these animals can capture from the type of data that they actually have, right? So there's things like vision of the other flies. And here we're computing things like what is the distance to each of the other flies in a bunch of different directions. This kind of touch features like the distance between pairs of key points, and they're kind of named pairs of key points because a fly should know which part of its body touched another fly, and it maybe even knows what part of the body of that other fly it touched. So we've kind of tried to just come up with some features here that each of the agents is getting. And so then those kind of features are put into a black box deep network. We have kind of a convnet layer that kind of represents the sensory feature transformations. And then it goes into just a giant transformer. And that's our full model. It's
instead the active sensing.
Yeah, it is not doing active sensing.
It's turning the body to see the line of the limb.
Yeah, so it just sees it sees all flies in all directions, and it just sees the distance to them. We know that flies are really sensitive to motion, and so the point of kind of putting this convnet in there is actually, so it's a convolutional over both space and time. So the convolution over time was explicitly to try to get motion-based features. But yeah, it's not doing any active sensing, but I don't think flies need to do active sensing to detect motion.
I mean, like the simplest active sensibility, if I want to leave behind the turn my body in that way.
Okay, well, flies have a really large field of view, right? So they can actually see 270 degrees, I think. So yeah. Yeah.
You would incorporate that kind of geometric limit in your.
I think we ended up not doing it, but we could.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then the output of this, which maybe I haven't shown yet, is motor signal.
Yeah.
So presumably, just to play devil's advocate with my own complaint about this, it could generate output that would become active sensing, no?
It could, yeah,
Because if that's what the
absolutely.
animals do,
If that's what it's doing, it should, yeah, exactly, yeah. And yeah, so
What is the sensory transfer here?
it's completely learned. So it's just a so this which part this part like what are these different things?
The transfer that like takes the world state into like.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is that transfer?
So it's this stuff. So it's taking kind of the world state, putting it into like an egocentric coordinate system. So you kind of know like the distance to the arena walls, and you know kind of the position of the other flies relative to this fly, and then it computes these 4 different types of features. So like if you know kind of in the egocentric coordinate system, you can compute kind of the angle and the distance to all of the other flies, and that's kind of one of the sensory features.
maybe we'll call it a superset of all the things the animal might have access to.
Yeah.
But in their frame of reference.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, the animal might have access to more stuff than this, right? Like we're not modeling olfactory sensing, for instance, partly because we don't know what to do there. It would be lovely if someone could, make it apparent to us, and we've talked to kind of the chemists at Janelia about whether there's some way to make olfactory, kind of chemicals glow in the dark or something like that. That would be amazing. But there are other things that are available to the fly, but these are kind of the first ones that we've put in. And I think we're building a library for this, or we have built a library. We're hoping to submit it to NeuroAI next week. And part of it is that biologists, we hope, will mess around with this part of it in particular, right? This is kind of the constraint of what information is available to the animal. Okay, yeah, and so the output of this is some kind of motor signal. Here we're not thinking so much about biological realism. We're mostly thinking about representations that are amenable to the machine learning. And so right now it's just a velocity of this of the pose of the animal. So kind of how it's moving in this kind of this space that's defined by the key points.
Your code includes the limbs and
and
things like that. Okay.
We're not tracking the antennae, but it includes all the legs and everything, yeah. And I made up a very complicated pose representation. I maybe didn't need to, but I did, yeah. It's kind of a graphics model inspired thing of what is the angle of this leg and all of these things. But in 2D, so yeah, not super realistic. So this is kind of what the transformer model looks like. So we kind of take all of that sensory information and we just kind of concatenate it all together. And then we also have kind of the previous behavior output as an input. This goes into this convolutional network. There's a positional encoding, which is kind of an important component of transformers. And then this just predicts kind of one frame ahead what the behavior will be. So what this kind of change in pose will be in the next time point. And what we've been spending, as you know, we've all discussed already, we've been spending a lot of time kind of on what kind of a representation of the pose output, the behavior output is amenable to kind of this distribution modeling and one-hot encodings. And what we've settled on right now, and we've tried many other things, but actually the first thing we tried so far is still working the best, is we're taking a few of the features and we are discretizing them independently. So we're just kind of binning them independently. And those are like the forward velocity, the sideways velocity, the change in orientation, and then the wing angles. And then the rest of them are continuous features that are actually not modeled as a distribution. So it's just outputting one value for that. Yeah.
Can you just give us more details about what you mean by delta pose?
A delta pose, yeah. So I haven't gone into enough detail about that okay, so I have this kind of representation of the pose of the animal. It takes so there are 19 key points that we're using here, so it's a 38-dimensional representation, and then it computes 26 different features from it. So it's the forward velocity, so there's kind of a global component of it, which is the forward velocity, the sideways velocity, and the change in orientation. And then there's a local component of it, which is like the change in the angle of the left middle leg or something like that.
There's a time scale.
Yes, there's a time scale, which is the rate that we recorded the data at, so the video frame rate, which is 150 frames per second. And it's an arbitrary time scale that is kind of constrained by what cameras can do. It's not really sensibly chosen. Okay, yeah. I put this here because it kind of, it's related to the library that we've been developing, but this kind of the action label is kind of the output of this network is computed through a series of operations, right? So we kind of compute this pose representation, we compute a velocity, then we do stuff that's important for machine learning, like z-scoring, discretizing, and then we finally get this output here. So it's kind of a complicated sequence of operations. Some anecdotal results. So this is a plot of the predictions and the ground truth of the tracking of the fly and the predictions of the model. Just to kind of zoom in on a few of these, just to tell you what they are. This is one of these discrete features. The blue is the truth, or cyan is the truth, and then the magenta is the predicted, right? So remember, it's like a one-hot encoding of the true label. So there's just going to be one bin that is cyan, and then the prediction is kind of a probability of each of those bins, and so that's what the magenta is showing. And then these are two of these kind of continuous features. So the black is the truth, and then the red is or the color is the prediction. And just to keep in mind, this is just one frame into the future prediction. It's not like we've actually, like, not showing that we can like forecast what a fly will actually do. Like the things that you should maybe be impressed about, or like things that I was looking at, like this is a debug plot that I made while I was doing this, is that like, it's not like the red kind of is lagging behind by one frame, right? It's actually kind of anticipating when to kind of go up in reasonable ways. And I thought this head angle was actually kind of interesting because we actually didn't think we were tracking the head with enough resolution to do anything. And the flies are pretty small in this video. And so like the kind of head angle, like the amount of movement that there is in the fly head is basically a couple pixels that we can see there. But there does seem to be a little bit of signal here, which I was actually kind of surprised about. And we've been talking a little bit with Eugenia Chiappe about this.
So just the time scale of that plot.
Yeah.
The rise time to the L1 angle, is that like 2 or 3 frames, or is that one? I mean, I'd be very surprised if it's one frame for the rise time, so it's a big piece.
It is, I don't know. It's a good question. Like, what is this correspond to? It's a good question. Yeah, no, I don't know.
very, very short. It's like 1 or 2 frames.
Yeah. I think it's like, but our frame rate is 150 hertz, right? So it's not, I mean, I think kind of a stride is, I think, 5 or 10 frames or something like that. So you might be just used to looking at it at a higher temporal resolution.
Just technical question. So you're training on all the other data, then for this data, you're taking everything up to the current point and predicting one point.
Yes.
Then sliding that window, taking over that point and predicting the next one. So it's not predicting a trajectory
Exactly.
or something like that. It's just
You should be less impressed than this looks by this. Yeah.
got a lot of system ID. So I
Yeah.
know one step ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like it's a useful thing to look at for debugging, but like not really the proof that it's doing anything interesting. So this is doing, I think, what you were thinking of. This is kind of doing what a language model does, which is kind of just predicting an open loop. And so the kind of less bold flies are real flies. These are the trajectories of real flies. And then this fly is a synthetic fly that's just being generated kind of in open loop. So it kind of takes a few frames of real trajectory, and then it starts predicting in open loop kind of for some number of frames.
In predict the first frame, you use the real data. But
Yeah.
when you slide it, do you take the synthetic data?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and I'll show you how that's like extremely annoying to program, and I will show you, like, that's kind of the contribution of our library, basically, for this. Yes.
When you say the bold one and it's on the synthetic data, does it depend on the other flies too? Yes.
So it can see and touch, like it can sense the other flies. Now, importantly, the other flies can't sense it, right? And so that's actually where you will tell, you can definitely tell that this is not real data. Like you can kind of see like that fly kind of, like there's no physics in this model. You should be like impressed that the fly stays in the chamber because there's like nothing that keeps it in there, right? And so that this is kind of a problem with machine learning, right? When you test on things that are out of distribution of what it was trained on, the model might do crazy stuff. And we do actually see that, and we keep trying not to care too much about it, but it is like, because it's like visually very salient, we are spending a lot of time trying to make that work better. Yeah, it is like, yeah, so the real flies can't see this, and then they're kind of out of distribution things that happen.
We tried building this model for a single fly, so without being in a social context.
We have not. Yeah, we have not. And I think that's kind of like, once this is working, the thing we should do is so yeah, this is data that we started with. Anne and I worked on this project a while back. It's the Maybe 2022 challenge. It's just like data that I happen to have loaded into my Python environment when I was like, oh, we should try this. And like the transformers were like kind of the best thing in this Maybe 2022 challenge. So this is not the right data set to like do biology, right? It's just a data set that I can debug code on. And like you can kind of like, I like this because you can kind of like look at it and see if interesting things are happening. But it would like all of like every single type of experiment that exists out there would be interesting to do. I'm actually, I think, less interested in just like a single animal than like actually there being some kind of, experimental stimuli given to it, because I think I would like there to be a little bit more, like when you just have an animal by itself, it's very, I don't know, it's very stochastic what happens, right? Like it's just, there's nothing to kind of control its behavior. It's just going to randomly start doing something at different time points, right? But I would like to kind of see, how well this actually kind of behaves when there is a, an expected type of behavior there.
And have you tried to use a mutated certain gene, behavior gene, social gene?
Yeah.
As a problem inside.
These are actually that. These are actually GAL4 lines where we have activated courtship neurons with TRIP. And so in this Maybe 2022 data, we have a bunch of different GAL4 lines. We've only been training on the courtship flies because they like react in interesting ways to the other flies. And it kind of was just a way for us to kind of visually see this. But I think that is one of the experiments that is ongoing right now, is to like train on a corpus of lots of different GAL4 lines and then see if like the hidden state of the network is predictive of what the GAL4 line was. And that actually was the challenge in the maybe 2022 challenge that we came up with.
How about some human analog gene, like autism?
We haven't done that.
And take a look at social behavior.
Yeah, we haven't done that. Most of our, like, we don't, like, I don't touch flies. Like, people give me flies, right? And so Janelia is very much into GAL4 lines. Yeah.
Seems like a supernatural thing to do would be to use like one of Dickinson's little robot flies, where you have total control over its movement. You could put it in closed loop with the fly, and then you could even add like what Floris van Brugel does, where it's optogenetically excited olfaction that you then have complete control over. And then you can actually test things like generalization. You can find your own timescales of interaction.
That is like the thing, like we have a colleague that we're not doing the robot fly. I was actually an author, co-author on the first robot fly paper. Yeah. But it works pretty well with just projections of images of flies, because flies are so visual. So we have a collaboration with Adrian Otapalik. I have a slide about it at the very end of kind of putting this in closed loop with a real fly. And that's kind of the test, right? Like you come up with hypotheses of like algorithms that you think are happening that are interesting here, and you want to actually see how it works with a real fly. Right. Okay, so we can simulate one fly. Like the real flies can't see the simulated fly. We can also simulate all of the flies. So these are all simulated flies, and they can all kind of see and touch each other, sense each other. We don't see them running through each other. There are other, potential issues with it, but it does kind of seem somewhat reasonable. And, a lot of what we've been doing, like, is this eyeball test of like, does this look okay? But we do have some quantitative stuff that I'll talk about in a few minutes. How am I doing on time?
15 minutes since people asking questions anyway. So
okay.
Hard stop at 10:30.
Okay, great. Right. So so we've been just kind of trying to dig into what the model is doing. What is it actually learning? So this is we've just kind of taken one particular time point for the fly. This kind of white trajectory here is what the fly actually did. It's a stochastic model, and so we can do 1,000 different rollouts of possible futures for that fly according to our model. And what Arun did is she clustered it based on where that fly ended up. Like, did it end up near the blue fly, or did it end up near the green fly or the red fly or whatever? And kind of like looked at those different trajectories. And so we're plotting the trajectories there. And then here are kind of videos of those different rollouts for each of those different clusters of where the fly kind of ends up. So the top left one is the real fly's trajectory. And then these are kind of 5 different things corresponding to the 5 different places that this fly can end up. And so again, those kind of trajectories are, I don't know, to me, they look plausible, right? And one of the things that we're actually quite interested in is what we hope to work on with kind of this closed loop system with the projection of a fly that interacts with the real fly is kind of looking at, when a fly is courting, how does it choose among all of the different flies, which fly to court? And, like if it is courting one fly, is it ignoring? Is there kind of some kind of attention mechanism that is ignoring all of the other flies? Or is it just kind of a stochastic process that it just like decides to follow this fly and then follow that fly? Yeah.
In general, what's your strategy for going from a synthetic copy to an actual human interpretable algorithm?
Yeah.
It strikes me that in the field of NLP, LLMs didn't actually solve all the questions people had. It just superseded and sort of made them irrelevant from the perspective of machines talking.
Yeah. So that is like the whole second half of my talk that I will just mention very briefly, because we've talked a lot about this. But I think like we don't know how to do that, but I think that's like a critical place that I think research should be done. And I think neuroscientists should be collaborating with machine learning researchers on that exact problem, because we don't know and I would say for any of the types of models that we've been talking about, right? Like maybe they're interpretable, maybe you think they're interpretable. All of these things, they all need to be tested, right? They're all just hypotheses. And it is kind of like, especially, like things that I'm sure Pavan will talk about, right? Like kind of when you kind of take some mechanistic components and you put some machine learning stuff with it, you still kind of need to be able to understand what's going on. So I think kind of interpretability, like mechanistic interpretability, explainable AI are super important fields that we should like are critical for AI for science. Yeah, okay. So the point of this library, the thing that's kind of like super annoying with it is this kind of simulation, right? The simulation is very important. And what we have to be able to do for this, right? So what we're doing when we're doing simulation is we're kind of taking a context window of behavior. We're just predicting one time point into the future. And then we have to generate the like sensory input from this kind of delta pose, right? So this delta pose is a velocity. And so how do we get kind of all of the sensory information from there? And so what I showed you before, right, is kind of this is kind of the pipeline of operations that gets applied to go from the original key points that we have to kind of the output action label, right? And basically what we need to be able to do is to invert that, right? So we need to be able to go from these action labels back up to key points and then put those key points into kind of the global coordinate system again with all of the other flies. And then we need to kind of generate the sensory features again. And it seems like a very simple idea to like keep track of these inversions, but that was kind of the key insight that Arun had, is to kind of define these different operations that are all hopefully invertible. And notably, a lot of these things are actually not invertible, so it's kind of a mess still to kind of do this type of thing, right? Like discretization is not actually invertible, right? Or going from velocity to position, you have to integrate velocity, but you still need to know what the initial pose of the animal was. So there's kind of some amount of messiness that like made this actually quite hard to do. And yeah, you can kind of do multiple agents this way. But yeah, so Arun has been building this library where we have kind of these data objects that have that kind of correspond to the inputs and the outputs. And each of them has a list of operations that created it. And each of those operations that you define has kind of a forward method and an invert method that you define. And that allows us to kind of make all of this bookkeeping of how you go from all of these different representations of the data to any of the other representations mostly seamless. It's still like there's still some amount of messiness of kind of the inversion that we need to keep track of that we are still working on, but we're hoping to kind of make this something so that biologists can play with lots of different types of sensory representations, and for ourselves so that we can kind of change what is the kind of output representation and try lots of different machine learning methods without this being kind of a huge spaghetti of code of all of the different types of representations we've played with. Okay, so I'll mostly skip over this, but I think like these kind of this like generative model, I don't know of a single example in science where we have learned something useful from a generative model of anything. Like a lot of machine learning, right, is we have a task and we just want to accomplish that task, right? So like AlphaFold is a really great example of machine learning for biology, but nobody's really understood how it's doing that prediction, right? But the prediction itself is useful. But I think it is really interesting that these machine learning models can do something beyond the ability of a human. They can kind of model this distribution of behavior, I think better than I can model the distribution of behavior. And so, I think there is something useful that these models are learning about behavior or about whatever kind of you're modeling with it, but they're completely unproven, right? And I think there's a lot of research to do, and more than like I can do on my own to, be able to kind of figure out what these models are for. And so, yeah, to kind of make this actually useful for science, right? What do we need to do? And I've kind of put down here kind of our confidence or my confidence in whether we know how to do this kind of as a field, right? So we know how to collect big data sets, right? Like particularly like for behavior in our lab, we can just collect ridiculous amounts of data very, very quickly. We kind of know right now how to train machine learning models that behave like animals. We're working on this kind of figuring out what the model gets right. So kind of like, doing a lot of quantification, and a lot of what my research focuses on is kind of evaluation criteria. How do we kind of tell what's working and what's not? And that's actually been really important for the machine learning field. It's actually a lot of machine learning research right now is focused on, for all of these different types of generative models, agentic AI, how do you measure what's working? So that's kind of something we're spending a lot of time on. And then there's this kind of interpretability question. So how do we interrogate the model to understand how it's doing this, formulate hypotheses based on kind of what we see there, and then design experiments to test. So I think all of those steps are important. I'm going to skip what those steps are. I think so I'm going to maybe just kind of put these last two slides here. So, one question is whether you believe this is like a model of the behavior of the animal. Like, do you think that this model actually behaves like the animal? I think that's an open question. And I think an interesting thing to think about, like where will we have kind of this kind of, thank you. I don't know how to get that back. No, I think it's still here. Stop share. It's there. Might be seeing my notes view, but that is what it is. I can maybe change that. Okay. Right. So you might, there's this kind of question of like, is this, this kind of convergent evolution, right? Like you see convergent evolution of algorithms, across different species. You see algorithms that computer scientists have developed, kind of having some parallels in animals. So I do think there will be some things that hopefully match between what this model does and what the animal actually does, but we still need to see what happens there. The other way, I think that if you're a complete skeptic, I think the thing that you could say is that this is like a representation, right? Like you could think of the people who are very skeptical about the power of large language models or what large language models are doing. Like, are they actually intelligent, or are they just like an encapsulation of the entire internet? Like, even if they're just an encapsulation of the entire internet, if all they've done is compressed the internet into a trillion parameter neural network, that's still kind of impressive. And it's something where you can kind of put in queries and get answers that mean something. And that's I think the worst case for this transformer type of model is that it is an encapsulation of all of the data that you've collected that you can query, right? And you can query it with kind of explainable AI or mechanistic interpretability types of experiments that I didn't talk about. But there are things that are maybe somewhat natural for us as neuroscientists to actually be able to ask about that data set. And so that's kind of the other view that I have of this kind of work. Yeah. And just to show you this, we have this kind of collaboration on kind of projecting synthetic flies to interact with the real fly. We can track the fly in real time. We have something that may or may not have been necessary, but to kind of make the world look 3D to this fly. Have you seen these chalk paintings where if you stand in one particular place, it looks 3D? So we're doing that for the fly. We're kind of tracking where it is and then projecting the world so that it looks 3D to it. This is a proof of principle. So this is a fly and this is kind of what we're projecting so that this other fly looks real to it. A thing that we did that we also may or may not have needed to do is we took our fly body model that Pavan knows about, and it's a little walking, 100-dimensional, 100 degrees of freedom fly that it can interact with. It may or may not be useful rather than just a circle, which is what most people use.
See them interacting here?
Yeah, they are. So just one fly with a synthetic fly, right? Yeah. So and it's following it, right? So we're activating their P1 neurons, which are their their courtship kind of related things, and they'll chase anything. Yeah, it could be a dot. Yeah, it doesn't have to be very real. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that first paper that we wrote with Michael Dickinson, we originally had planned on putting, that we had a magnet that we drove around. We had originally planned on gluing a real fly to it or something, so it looked fly-like, and then we figured out that they would just chase the magnet, and yeah, flies are simple guys. Yeah, so yeah, I'll end there, but I think our goal here is kind of to make these kind of machine learning approaches easy for theorists and neuroscientists to use. That's kind of always been the focus of our lab, is taking things that are working in machine learning, making it something that's pretty easy to put in, right? You all do PCA all the time because, it's useful, it makes sense, but also it's just easy to do, right? And if we can kind of make these types of things just easy to use and figure out, what their strengths and weaknesses are, then we hope that this is a tool. All right, thanks.